All right, coming to you live from WRUE in Tennessee. It's the Scribbling Woman.
Hi, I'm Nancy Rue. You're a scribbling woman too, so welcome back to Women Creating Writerly Lives and to part 4 of our series on the craft and the writerly life. Now, we hear it all the time from health pundits and even our own personal physician. Lower your stress level. Don't hold tension in your body. Seek nirvana because tension and stress will kill you. Well, I'm not going to argue that point one way or the other, but I will speak this writerly truth to you. When we're shaping a plot or building the narrative in a piece of nonfiction, tension is what keeps it alive. Now, seriously, ponder what we've talked about in the first 3 episodes of the Craft and the Writerly Life series. In episode 58, you discovered a through line, which is not a smooth road from one funky conflict to a perfectly happy outcome. We have our characters dealing with questions like, what do I do when my wall of convictions crumbles down and threatens to fall on top of me? How can that be an easy road? You've created a character arc after episode 59, which takes your protagonist from the question you're posing to an answer like, the wall has to crumble so you can see beyond it to yourself. Well, a journey like that is fraught with tension. And then in our last episode, number 60, you determined the turning points that will lead your protagonist to the meeting of that hidden need. In other words, the answer to the question, each one of which involves overcoming an obstacle, like in Susie Schmo's case, remember her? The husband leaving, the daughter getting arrested, the church kicking her out. You see where I'm going with this, right? The bottom line is, if we want our story to be satisfying to our readers, then we have to incorporate tension and lots of it. But don't go into a blue funk, okay? Today we'll explore just what tension is, how we can build it, and how we can make it delicious without stressing ourselves out. First of all, what do we mean by tension in writing? When I quote Donald Moss saying there has to be tension on every page, writers often cry, that sounds depressing. And yet, is there anything more maddening than a story in which nothing critical happens until the last 3 chapters? In fact, how often as a reader do you get to those last 3 chapters? There is an entire constellation of tension types to incorporate. Obviously, there's the physical danger, natural disasters, although I've never figured out why they're actually natural, accidents. So you might have a protagonist hanging off a collapsed bridge or getting swept up in a tornado or having a close encounter with a runaway train. Those are automatically tension producing. Most of the tension we want to see is between characters. Can you get an hour into your day without interacting in some way with another person, whether that's in person or online or on social media or via text? Does it always go smoothly? Does the level of conflict range from somebody didn't tell you they used the last roll of toilet paper to a heated argument over why the bank account has reached its dregs? The everyday tensions between people need to punctuate our stories to give them texture and reality. Now, your characters don't have to be bickering over everything. There can even be an ongoing and sometimes humorous battle, like who makes the best coffee, or how high is the pile of junk mail on the dining room table going to get before somebody throws it away? Some of the tensions we weave in are delicious. Sexual tension, the things unsaid, the elephant in the room. Again, the best tensions that will best take your protagonist through those turning points are the actual issues that characters have with each other. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But first, understand that extremely important to the meeting of the hidden need is the tension within the protagonist herself. Even in the case of multiple points of view, the character who has center stage will need to have some inner conflict going on. What would Hamlet be without the soliloquy about whether to be or not? What makes the Fiddler on the Roof more memorable than Tevye singing On the Other Hand? The interior dilemma goes on all the time with your character. whether to confront or keep her mouth shut, whether to suck it up or put his foot down, whether to tell the truth and hurt somebody in the moment or tell a lie and hurt them in the long run. There's also regret over whatever decision they did make. Again, this doesn't mean that your protagonist is tied up in knots all the time. But if he never doubts himself, if she never feels guilty, if they never have to make a tough choice, then you will have an insufferable character who nobody can relate to. I loved me some Nancy Drew, but I could not relate to her. Now, if you look over your through line, the hidden need, the turning points, you'll probably see that you have a large canvas of possible tensions. And while your character will have victories, major and minor, those won't be satisfying unless he or she has done the work. So how do we build that tension? Well, today we're going to start simple. When I taught elementary school students how to construct a story, I used the concept of the magic 3, and it goes like this. Your protagonist has a goal, something that's important to them. But the meeting of the goal is thwarted, usually because of an antagonist, and that creates the problem. So the protagonist uses 3 different ways to solve that problem. The first 2 are disastrous. They make the situation increasingly worse. The third one solves the problem because it uses what the protagonist has learned from the first 2 mistakes. So I would take kids through a sample story in which they got to fill in the blanks. So just for fun, we're going to do that today. All right. Once upon a time, there was a 13-year-old boy named, now I would say that 70% of the time the kids would say Bob. No clue why that was, but today we're going to go with Bob. So once upon a time, there was a 13-year-old boy named Bob. He was kind of skinny and nerdy, but he was a nice kid. And all he wanted in the world was to say hi to a girl in his class named, now this is where it got interesting, because while they would invariably choose Bob, the girl got something exotic like Tallulah or Sylvia. We're going to call ours Ginger. All right. So his goal was to say hi to Ginger and have her say hi back. Well, he had tried all school year and he could never get her alone. But now that summer vacation was about to start, he had a plan. He knew that she went to the beach every day in the summer, so he decided he would go there, wait for her to walk by, and casually say, "Hi, Ginger." Now, Bob couldn't swim, not a single stroke. So the beach wasn't his favorite place, but beautiful Ginger was certainly worth a pair of sandy shorts and $4.95 for a bottle of suntan lotion. So the first day of summer vacation, Bob got on his bike, rode to the beach, spread out his towel, and settled himself down to wait. And sure enough, there was Ginger, strolling along the edge of the surf, her hair blowing in the breeze, her sunglasses sparkling in the light. But from the other direction, he could see, now here they got to fill in the name of the big nasty class bully. And that was usually something like Mac or Buck or Thor. We're going to call ours Duke. So he could see Duke, the big nasty class bully, complete with his gang of cronies, because they always have them, moving hard and fast in his direction. They crowded around Bob and kicked the edge of his beach towel. "Hey, Skinny," said Duke. "Why don't you go in the water?" "Yeah, why don't you go in the water?" whined the cronies. "Are you scared?" snarled a particularly crappy little crony. Bob looked up and saw Ginger drawing nearer by the second. If he refused to go in, this pack was sure to stuff sand up his nostrils and insert him headfirst into a conch shell. There was only one thing to do. Bob jumped up and said, "No problem. I dig the water," and headed for the waves. "I'll just wade in and hang out, maybe splash a little," he thought, "and if they don't leave, I can always say hi to her from out there." So he walked out into the surf until the water was a little over his waist. It was cold, but not too bad otherwise. He turned back to look at the shore, where Duke and his band of no-gooders was clearly trying to recover from this unforeseen turn of events. Ginger was still moving blithely in his direction. And then suddenly, Bob felt something cold, slimy, and totally unwelcome travel up the left leg of his swim trunks. A fish. There was a fish in his shorts. This is where the real problem begins. So I would say to the class, what does Bob try first? Well, it often went from the obscene to the ridiculous, but we usually landed on he reaches into his trunks to try to pull the fish out. Nice solution, but it gets worse, right? What happens? Well, sometimes they would have the fish bite him in the butt and they would try some other body part, but I wouldn't let him get away with that. But we're going to go with the fish bites Bob on the hand and won't let go. So now what does he do? The situation is worse. Those people are still standing on the shore. He has to meet his goal. So he does something with his fish attached to his hand. Okay. Some of them said, you bite the fish and it lets go. We're going to go with he throws the fish, but it's still hanging on and it drags both of them underwater. Recall then that Bob cannot swim. Then finally, he has one last chance. So he comes to the surface. He waves the fish around and goes, hey, look what I caught. Well, Duke and his cronies are howling with laughter. Ginger's not even 20 feet away, shading her eyes, quizzically looking at him. And he's almost desperate enough to drown himself. And then, what happens? Well, this is the one that is my favorite. So we're going to go with this one. So he comes to the surface again, pulls off his trunks, turns around and moons the cronies. Well, the cronies about pass out. Duke stands there, jaw slack. The cronies run away in fear. And Ginger is grinning from ear to ear. So Bob looks at Ginger and says, hi. And she says, hi. Now, that exercise was not only hilarious, but it allowed the students to write their own Magic 3 stories. Now, it's pretty simplistic, right? But it does apply to our more mature work. It's a basic way to shape the underlying structure. You have the inner turning points and the events that happen to get the protagonist to make those turns, right? We talked about that in episode 60. Well, you probably have more than 3 turning points. I have 6 in my current novel. And you have positive moves aided by allies and the protagonist's inner progress. Now, in order for that journey to pay off, look at each of your turning points and try this. Is the obstacle, the problem that has to be overcome at this point, bad? So in the beginning, we want it to be bad. Is it Susie's fight with her husband, the call from the principal's office, the funky feeling of the Bible study? Next turning point, how can you make it worse? The husband storms out. The principal says it is urgent that she come in person. The protagonist overhears 2 women in the kitchen talking trash about her at Bible study. And then, how can you make it the worst at that point? The husband left his phone behind, and Susie sees that he's been messaging a divorce lawyer. The principal asks where the kid is. She seems to be missing. The head of the Bible study group suggests that she take a little sabbatical. Now, as the obstacles worsen, the protagonist is more and more challenged. So does Susie Schmill have to get a job to make ends meet after hubby jumps ship? Is the only one that she can find at a home for at-risk girls? Is it so bad she starts fostering some of them? You see how this can escalate, right? Is it not delicious? Now, unless you're writing about a rock star who continually self-sabotages and dies of an overdose at the end, your protagonist is going to change for the better through all of this. A solution is in sight. I mentioned earlier that the tensions that will best take your protagonist through those turning points are the actual issues that characters have with each other. So will you try this? And this is also outlined in the Google Doc. Will you turn a piece of paper horizontally and then list all of your characters on the left and those same characters across the top? So squares will form. You can either draw those squares in or just imagine that they're there. Then in each square, jot down what tension does exist between these 2 characters, or if none does, make a note of that too. So in our Susie Schmo story, we'd have Susie, her husband, each of the 2 kids, the principal, the pastor, Jamaica, the recovering drug addict, the 4 women in the Bible study, etc. They would be down this side and across the top. And then you could fill in, okay, what is Susie's issue with her husband? What is Susie's issue with the pastor? What is Susie's issue with so-and-so? And then we go, okay, the husband, what's his issue with Susie? What's his issue with the pastor? What's his issue with his son? In the Harold P. Schwartz story, remember him? He was the hospitalist, okay? We'd have Harold, his wife, his lover, his boss, a couple of his colleagues, the old man he ends up taking care of, the old man's wife, etc. And you do the same thing there. Now, as you do that, you will just write down your initial thoughts and then go back and ask yourself 6 questions to flesh this out. Question number 1. As you look at your chart, does your protagonist get along with absolutely everybody? That's not a good sign. Give them a conflict with somebody, preferably several somebodies. Who does your protagonist have issues with as the story opens? Can you ratchet up that tension as the story progresses? Who does your protagonist experience conflict with when they first meet in the course of the story, like Susie in Jamaica? How can you heighten that tension in the pages that follow? Who are the people that your protagonist gets along best with? Can some tension develop between them as events occur in the story? Who's your protagonist's most loyal ally? Can conflict arise that threatens their relationship? Are there places where negative tension can turn to positive tension? This is my favorite. Perhaps your protagonist is at odds with someone, but has to learn to trust him or her, has to depend on that person, or finds out their differences can work in their favor toward a common goal. To me, that sounds yummy. Are there places where the reverse could happen, where positive tension can turn negative? Clever banter turns into bickering as familiarity breeds contempt. So once we have all kinds of juicy tensions outlined, how do we know we have the right tension? Well, let's ask questions in 2 areas. First, questions to ask about the protagonist. Does the obstacle that you've created, this tension, move the protagonist toward the meeting of the hidden need? So if Susie's questioned by the police, that might humiliate her enough to see past her pride. Or does it just stir things up so your reader won't get bored and really has nothing to do with the hidden need? If Susie's forced to endure a body cavity search, does that take her anywhere? Anybody's going to be humiliated by that. Does it allow your protagonist to have some agency? Or does it happen to them in a way that kind of makes them powerless for too long? If Harold suffers a broken leg in an accident, he might have to see things from his patient's point of view. Putting Harold in a coma brings the whole story to a halt. Now, let's consider the questions for you to ask yourself. As you write, do you feel anxious for your character, but not hopeless? Do you feel tension in your jaw and your neck and your lower back? That's actually a good thing. Is your character, on the other hand, saying, enough, stop already? Characters often express this by becoming bitter and snarky when you don't want them to, or becoming paralyzed by the volume of trauma that you've written them into, and you can't write them out of it in any realistic way. Do you feel at home with your story? Do you know that this is going to be satisfying, not only for your protagonist and your reader, but for you? Now, let's talk about how the writerly life that we've been cultivating through the past couple of years of episodes can help you as you, let's face it, make your characters suffer. This week, one of our younger scribblies texted me and said, I have to kill off a character, and it's so depressing. I'm so emotional. I don't know if I can do it. I can't even write right now. So first I told her, well, do a little grieving, do a little mourning, and then let's think about a couple of things you might do. You may need time and space to imagine your protagonist at their worst and see how they got there. That sort of takes you out of the picture so that you're not paralyzed. You may need to venture out from your usual writing space and dialogue with your protagonist, either verbally, silently, or in writing. You might do that standing at the end of a dock or while you're splashing paint onto a canvas. And you may have to get some of it on you. Get as close to your protagonist's suffering as you can to see what's involved, what could happen next. When I was writing Healing Waters, Sullivan Crisp was contemplating suicide. And he was doing that from the Shelby Street Bridge in Nashville. The Shelby Street Bridge is a walking bridge. So I went downtown and I went on the bridge and I walked around and then I stood there and imagined contemplating suicide. It was very telling, and I managed for Sullivan to talk himself out of it. Of course, as I was standing there, a police officer came up to me and said, "Are you all right? What's going on?" So I must have been putting on a pretty good show. So for Susie Schmo, who gets kicked out of the church, you might simply want to go and stand in front of some locked church doors. For Harold, who ends up taking care of an old couple and is not real happy about it, you might want to push someone in a wheelchair. Just don't, like accost some poor person in the doctor's office. And then finally, you may need to brainstorm with a trusted scribbling sidekick or even a non-writer friend just to see how can I raise the tension. And it'll be okay because you're here with me. Jim has helped me take stories to places I would have missed. However you find the tension, go over the top as you make your way. Go ridiculously, unbelievably absurd, because you never know what snippets and nuggets you might find there. So, do you want Harold to get hit by a car driven by the girlfriend that he dumped and end up on the side of the road where he's instructing the paramedics on how to take care of him before he loses consciousness? Well, maybe not that whole thing, but there is some piece in there that could work. I think he definitely needs to get run over by this girlfriend. Is it really feasible for Susie to open her home to recovering young drug addicts? Probably not, but she could discover her daughter's smoking pot and has to figure out how to handle that with compassion, or she's going to lose that kid altogether. So at this point, you have everything possible. You've gone completely over the top. Now you can pull back. You can cut out what's really not going to work. You have to see what's impossible to know what is. And it's often the idea that you have at the end of that search that's really going to grab you. Now, if you're feeling a little sadistic now, there's more to come. As next time in episode 62, we talk about raising the stakes and reaching the bleakest moment. For now, I recommend reading chapter 27 in the Scribbling Woman Interactive Companion about going deep. And you might also want to read The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Moss. I don't have a copy because I keep buying them and then giving them away. That's how good it is. If you want a Google Doc, which outlines what we've talked about today, including all the questions, just simply go to nancyrue.com/podcast to find the link that will take you there. You can also go there for the link to the complete list of podcast episodes by category. Related to today's topic are episodes 35, 36, and 37. The most important thing for you to do between now and next time, though, is, of course, to scribble on.